What is going on, everybody? We are back on a rainy Thursday today. I'm in the garage, not able to get on the bike, but I have both bikes back in the garage, which is awesome. And I've been putting miles on both of them. Well, since it's raining today, I figured we'd hit a topic that I probably get the most questions on since I got the Road King back, and that is how much does it cost to put an S&S motor in your Harley? Now, for me, it was a 96 Road King. If you guys haven't seen the series, I bought it not expecting to put a motor in it. I bought it thinking that it was going to run well. It had 40,000 miles on it. It quickly developed an oil leak, and I took it to the dealer to address the oil leak and quickly found out that it had a failed cam bearing and it needed a whole new motor. So at that point, I had to decide whether I was going to let that $6,000 motorcycle just die on the vine, or if I was going to replace the motor and bring it back to life. And with how nice this 96 was, it wasn't even a question to me that I was going to put a motor in it. So there's a bunch of different options with S&S motors, but I'm going to go through kind of my situation today, and maybe that'll give you some kind of idea on how much it's going to cost to do in your bike. Let's get at it. So one of the first things you got to decide is whether you're going to rebuild your motor or if you're going to go with a brand new crate motor. For me, I was definitely going to go with a brand new crate motor. On a 25-year-old motorcycle, for me, we might as well just start fresh. All new components, you get a brand new setup, and basically you're turning your 25-year-old bike back into a new bike almost, with the main components. So you have to make that decision. If you're watching this video, you got to be considering your options on what you're going to do. If you rebuild the motor, obviously your parts cost will be less, but your labor cost will be higher. And if you decide to go to crate motor, your parts cost will be higher and your labor cost will be less. It just depends on what you want to do, but I'm going to choose the new motor every single time. It's just a better option, I feel like. I went with S&S because I was willing to spend the money to get the quality and get the warranty. I can't speak to other brands, so unfortunately, if you've got questions about, which brand to go with, I went with the tried and true S&S. That's what I was going to do. That's what the dealer recommended, and I was willing to spend that extra little bit of money and get a little bit less displacement back to make sure I had a quality motor going in the bike. So the next thing you're going to want to decide is the displacement motor to buy for your project. S&S offers a huge variety of different motors for each category. They have evolution replacement motors, they have twin cam replacement motors, and they range from anywhere from the 80-inch Evo motor that I bought all the way up to a 124 and even higher up into the 140s if you're looking for a hot rod and stuff like that. But you got to decide what your budget is. For me, my budget was very low, because I bought a bike not expecting it to need a complete overhaul, and I got some bad news that I was going to have to spend a lot of money in it. So my budget was very, very limited. I wanted to buy the bike to do a series on the Evo motor, so it was only natural for me with cost and with what I was wanting to do with this motorcycle that I was going to go with the stock replacement, this V80 motor. Now, when I say stock replacement, you are getting some S&S goodies in that V80. Like, this thing has better heads, it has a cam in it. You can go with their ignition. So you're getting a lot more performance out of that stock replacement 80-inch than you would just a standard 80-inch motor. And on top of that, it's brand new. But you have the option to go with a 96-inch motor or 111 or a 124 within the same confines of the Evolution series that S&S offers. Keep in mind that most of the time you have a stock transmission and a clutch in your bike, and I could have bumped up to the 96. I probably could have bumped up to the 111 had I had the budget, which I did not. But you've got to be mindful of your stock transmission and clutch parts. How long is that going to last if you put a 111 or a 124 in there? Or do you have the budget to go ahead and get all that done at the same time? That's a huge consideration for me to not have more problems with the bike going forward. So once you've chosen the displacement you want, you've got to choose whether you want it just as a long block or if you want to go with a whole kit with ignition and everything. I stayed with my Harley CV carb because of a couple of reasons. I know they do really well with altitude, and the trips I take, I knew I wanted a carb that does well in altitude. It's just I take 2 trips a year up to Colorado, and I always want to make sure that I can ride up there without issues. So I stay with my CV carb, and it helped me save just a little bit of money to reuse the carb. and tune it just for the SNS motor. Now, I did go ahead and upgrade the ignition. It's like $400 or so to do that, but 25-year-old ignition on a bike is a part you probably want to replace anyway. And so I decided that I was going to make I made the decision to replace the ignition just because I'll get a little bit more performance, and at the same time, the longevity, I won't have issues with it and stuff like that. Old ignition, new motor doesn't really jive with me, so I went ahead and replaced that. So now I was looking at a SNS V80 motor, long block only, so no carb. I bought the ignition, it was another $400. Stock transmission, stock clutch, we didn't do anything like that. You got to factor in, especially if you're not installing the motor yourself, which I'm definitely not installing a motor myself, is there's a lot of gaskets and little parts that are going to nickel and dime you. So you got to make sure you have the budget for the project. If you have time to wait to build up your budget to do the project because you want to go with a bigger motor or whatever, just make sure you've got a little bit of extra room in there to pay for all the gaskets you're going to need and snap rings and all kinds of just little parts. And also in an older bike, when they start tearing stuff apart, they're going to start finding things that need to be replaced. Like on my bike, when they got into the primary, they realized that A, it needed a bunch of gaskets, which is fine, and B, the stator was already in really bad shape and needed to be replaced. It's things like that that will add on to your bill that you're either going to want to replace because you don't have to pay the labor since they're already in there messing with stuff, or B, it just needs to be replaced and it's something you probably have to do in the middle of the motor build. So having a little bit of extra money for that is super helpful. It wasn't that bad on mine, but I definitely, the stator and stuff like that, I didn't plan on paying for it, which I really didn't plan on paying for any of it, but at the same time, be prepared for that little expense. So keep in mind, I've got my work order here, that these prices were from a Harley-Davidson dealer. Could I had this done at an independent dealer? Absolutely, I could have. It's just the dealer is where I had got my street glide service, and that's where I took the bike just to get a small repair done, and it ended up in pieces, and I pretty much wasn't going to shop around for the build, which maybe you should do if you have the time to do it. I just had a bike that needed a motor and was already in pieces, so it pretty much it got done at the dealer. So the labor rate is a little over $100 there. In your area, this may be a little bit different. So the motor itself was $46.05 and 95 cents. That's a V80 long block in the wrinkle black, just very standard 80-inch displacement motor, $46.05. Now, I did realize a couple of months after, or while my motor was being built, that they offered a sale on the 96-inch motors. So they do run sales from time to time. So keep an eye on that if you might be able to get the next up motor for the same price, stuff like that. So $46.05 and 95 cents was what it cost from SNS. Ton of gaskets and O-rings, like just, you know, a huge list of all the little stuff that goes into pulling a motor out and putting a new one in. Nothing crazy. $470 and 95 cents for the ignition kit, which is the high 4 ignition by SNS. All the stuff that comes with taking the primary off, primary covers and gaskets and oil and, you know, hoses and stuff like that, just making sure that everything is up to snuff with the new motor. I mean, you don't want to put a bunch of old gaskets or a bunch of old hoses on a brand new motor. So with all of that, we replaced the air filter and the whole intake assembly on mine as well, and that was about $170, $180 because they found out the intake on mine was leaking, so they replaced that. It's another one of those items that you're not expecting, but be ready for it. So with the motor, that cost I told you, plus all of the labor, it came out to $69.18 and 30 cents. So about $7,000. That's with the motor included. After all the labor at around $100 an hour, $7 grand. So pretty expensive. You think about a $6,000 motorcycle, putting $7,000 of a new motor in it. It's a lot of money. But if you have a bike that's been passed down to you from a, you know, that has family ties, or a bike that you love, that might be what it costs to put a new part in it, basically. And if you want to go to a bigger displacement, just keep in mind that cost is going to tack on ahead. And, you know, if you find a better deal or whatever, then maybe it'll be less. But About $7,000 is kind of what it costs for me. If you added on all the other stuff that I did at the same time, I did front and rear tire, I did bars and the cable kit and all that stuff, and the stator and new plugs and wires. It adds up pretty quick. I mean, I think I ended up out the door with everything that I had done with this bike around $9,000, which is a lot for a 96 Road King, but at the same time, I kind of was backed into a corner on it. I wanted to make it mine, and I wanted to make sure that it ran well for, the next generation, and I did that by spending the money on it. And it might not be worth what I put into it now, but at the same time, it's a lot of fun, and it's going to be just stone cold reliable, which is really what I'm looking for, and it's been a lot of fun already. So if y'all have any questions about the cost associated with the build or anything about my experience with this S&S motor, I've got another video coming talking about taking this thing back to the shop after my Broken Bow trip, which if you haven't watched Broken Bow, you definitely should. I got a 2-part video on there. But I took this thing back to a different shop other than the Harley dealer, and I think I might have taken my last Harley to the Harley dealer that I'm going to. I think I found a shop that I really like, and I think I should have been going with an independent shop the whole time. I know you guys will call me an idiot, but I'm going to make a video about it. This thing finally is 100%. I can say absolutely is 100%, and I'll tell you guys the shop that I got it done at and why it took so long to get this thing right. Until next time, guys, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.